These agency nurses never last when they meet real standards. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 48 hours before his entire world collapsed. He said it loudly, standing in the center of the surgical team during morning rounds at St. Michael's Hospital in Houston, his voice carrying the particular contempt of a man who had never once questioned his own certainty. The surgical nurses exchanged glances. The resident stared at her clipboard. Sarah Chen didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply continued checking the cardiac monitor in room 312, her hands moving with the fluid precision of someone who had done this same task in field hospitals under mortar fire, in convoy vehicles with shattered windows, in tents where the generator hummed like a living thing and the smell of diesel fuel mixed with antiseptic in ways that made civilians sick. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even close. St. Michael's hummed with the fluorescent buzz of corridor lights and the rhythmic beeping of 100 monitors. The antiseptic smell of bleach mixed with industrial coffee and something darker underneath, the metallic tang of blood that never quite washes out of a trauma hospital. Sarah moved through the night shift like water through a sieve, present but unnoticed, her scrubs perfectly pressed despite 12 hours on her feet, her dark hair pulled back so tight it looked like it might hurt. The other nurses kept their distance. Agency staff never lasted long at St. Michael's. Something about the culture ground them down. Something about the hours and the expectations and the casual cruelty of surgeons who treated contract nurses like they were temporary inventory. She preferred it this way. Anonymity was a weapon. Anonymity was survival. In her locker on the 3rd floor, tucked behind extra scrubs and a pair of compression socks she never wore, sat a pair of combat boots. The leather was cracked from 20 years of use. Desert sand still caked the treads, despite her best efforts to clean them. The laces were frayed at the ends. She had carried these boots through Tikrit when she was 26 years old and invincible. She had worn them while running toward the sound of small arms fire instead of away from it. She had knelt in them in the dirt beside a 6-year-old Iraqi boy with a shrapnel wound that shouldn't have been survivable, his eyes wide with pain and confusion, asking in a language she didn't speak for his mother. That boy had lived. Against all probability, against all medical logic, he had lived. She had performed field triage with rounds cracking overhead like angry insects, her hand steady, her mind clear, her entire body operating on the muscle memory of training that ran deeper than fear. His name was Marcus Webb. His blood type was AB negative. His recovery rate after bone marrow transplant was listed in classified files as optimal. He had become a Navy SEAL. 3 days ago, he had checked into St. Michael's with complications from a training accident, and Sarah had requested this exact posting through channels that didn't officially exist anymore, submitting credentials that were real but incomplete, lying by omission in ways that felt like the smallest thing she had ever done. Her mission was simple: keep him alive long enough to testify about what he had witnessed during his last deployment in Kandahar province. The testimony he carried could reshape intelligence operations across 3 continents. It could end careers. It could save lives. It could do 1,000 things that would never show up in any official report. She had reviewed his chart 6 times. His rare blood type made transfusion complicated. His injuries were serious but not critical. His survival rate was 94%, which meant 6% was the universe's way of keeping score. The fluorescent lights in the corridor outside room 314 flickered once, steadied, then hummed back into their mechanical rhythm. Sarah approached the room with the careful neutrality she wore like a second skin. Marcus Webb lay in the bed with his left leg in traction and his right arm bandaged, his Navy SEAL frame reduced to something fragile by morphine and gravity and the simple fact of human vulnerability. He was 32 years old. He had killed 23 people in combat, the number was in a file marked confidential that she had memorized. He had saved 47 civilians. His SEAL trident sat on the bedside table, catching the light. She adjusted his for without waking him, checking the flow rate, confirming the line was patent, her mind running through protocols while her body performed the work on autopilot. The heart monitor showed sinus rhythm at 68 beats per minute. Stable. Good. Everything proceeding according to the invisible plan that no one in this hospital was aware existed. When she turned to leave the room, Dr. Whitfield was standing in the doorway. He was a tall man with silver at his temples and the kind of posture that came from knowing exactly how much institutional power propped him up from underneath. His father had been a surgeon. His grandfather had been a surgeon. His brother-in-law was married to the hospital administrator's daughter. He had never in his life encountered a consequence he couldn't have dismissed with a phone call. He looked at Sarah the way a man looks at something that didn't quite belong in his field of vision. "The agency send you?" he asked. "Yes, doctor," Sarah said. Her voice was soft, deferential. The mask was perfect. "I've been with St. Michael's for 6 months. That's about 5 months longer than most of your colleagues manage," he said. He smiled like a surgeon who had just explained the necessity of amputation. "These agency nurses never last when they meet real standards." Sarah felt the words the way a combat veteran feels a mortar round. You don't hear the impact first, you feel the air pressure change. Her jaw clenched once, just once, the muscle tightening for a fraction of a second before she controlled it. She didn't respond. Responding would be a mistake. The best power was the power people didn't know you were holding. She simply nodded and moved past him into the corridor, her right leg carrying her forward with the slightest hitch that no one ever seemed to notice, that everyone assumed was a genetic quirk or the result of some minor accident. No one ever guessed it was a souvenir from a roadside bomb outside Fallujah. The cafeteria at St. Michael's occupied the basement level of the hospital's east wing, a fluorescent-lit space with tables that were always slightly sticky and a smell like industrial cheese mixed with desperation. Sarah sat at a corner table, her back against the wall, old habits, with a tray containing a salad, a small cup of cottage cheese, and water with lemon. She was reviewing Marcus Webb's updated blood work on her phone, her eye scanning the hemoglobin levels and platelet counts, when Dr. Whitfield walked past her table with his tray of prime rib and imported mineral water. He walked past. Then he stopped. Then he turned. His tray hit the corner of her table with the casual precision of a man who had calculated the angle. The salad bowl flipped. The cottage cheese cup tumbled across the table. The water spilled across her scrubs in a cold spreading stain that matched the color of fear in every other agency nurse's face in the cafeteria. "Clumsy," Dr. Whitfield said. "These hallways are so cramped, aren't they?" He walked away. The cafeteria went quiet for 3 seconds. Then conversations resumed. People pretended they hadn't seen anything. The unwritten code of hospitals meant that everyone had something to lose, a schedule they couldn't afford to change, a shift they couldn't miss, a reference they would need someday. Sarah sat very still. She felt the water cooling against her skin. She looked at her tray, now a casualty of someone else's power play. She did not shake. She did not flush red. She did not stand up. Instead, she wiped her hands with a napkin with the same methodical care she had used to tie tourniquets under fire, stood up, and walked to the bathroom to change her scrubs. In the mirror, her face was exactly the same, calm, composed, a woman enduring the minor humiliations that contract nurses absorbed like they were part of the job. No one was watching. No one knew that behind her brown eyes lived 20 years of black ops. 3 continents of classified work, a mind that had calculated 100 ways to hurt Dr. Whitfield in the time it took him to walk back to the surgical floor. Pain is information. That was the first thing they taught you in SEAL training, though Sarah had learned it long before, in a field hospital in Tikrit, holding a dying child and understanding that every sensation, every sharp edge of fear, every throb of exhaustion, every cold moment of betrayal, was data. You processed it. You filed it. You moved forward. She changed her scrubs methodically, running water over her hands in the staff bathroom, watching the water spiral down the drain like it was the most interesting thing in the world. 3 other nurses were in the room. None of them made eye contact. That was St. Michael's. That was how power worked when no one knew who they were actually standing next to. She dried her hands on a paper towel, rolled it into a ball, and tossed it into the bin with the kind of casual precision that revealed years of muscle memory honed in places that didn't exist on any map. 20 years. That's how long it had been since Tikrit. 20 years since she had held Marcus Webb's small hand and promised him in English he didn't understand that he was going to live, that his body was strong, that the war wouldn't win. She had kept that promise through bone marrow procedures and classified recovery protocols and a career that required her to disappear and reappear in different hospitals, different cities, different identities, always watching. Always waiting. She had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. The rest of the shift passed in the ordinary rhythm of a hospital, vital signs checked, charts updated, patients monitored, the quiet work of keeping people alive in systems designed by people who had never actually held a dying patient. Sarah moved through it all with a kind of invisible competence that made her the first choice for critical cases and the last person anyone remembered hiring. At 6:33 a.m., as the day shift was beginning to arrive, she checked on Marcus Webb one final time. His blood work remained stable. His vital signs were solid. His recovery was proceeding on schedule. She stood in the doorway of room 314 for exactly 5 seconds, watching him sleep, and in those 5 seconds she thought about the boy he had been and the warrior he had become and the way time could stretch a person across 2 decades and still leave them fundamentally unchanged. Some bonds, once forged, never broke. Some promises, once made, never expired. She adjusted the blanket across his chest, not because it needed adjusting, but because it was the kind of small act of care that kept people from wondering why she checked on him more than she checked on other patients. Then she left the room and clocked out, knowing that Dr. Whitfield had only just begun, that the worst was still coming, and that the quiet person in the room was about to become something else entirely. The question was when. The question was how far he would push before everything he thought he knew about her came apart in his hands like old paper. The chart files hit the tile floor like gunshots. Papers scattered across the hallway in a cascading fan, medication logs, vital signs, lab results, each one landing in deliberate, theatrical slow motion as Dr. Whitfield released them from chest height, his fingers uncurling with the practiced malice of someone who'd perfected the art of public humiliation. Sarah stood at the nurse's station 30 feet away, charting vitals from the morning rounds, and felt the moment the room went dead silent. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical hum above. 12 surgical residents had stopped mid-conversation. A cardiac tech froze with her hand on a monitor. Even the ventilators seemed to pause their wheeze. "Pick that up, sweetheart." Dr. Whitfield's voice carried the weight of a man accustomed to obedience. He smiled, not the smile of someone pleased, but the smile of someone testing the boundaries of what he could get away with. Unless agency training didn't cover basic organization. Sarah set down her pen with deliberate care. The metal edge touched the clipboard without a sound. She turned, meeting his eyes for one fraction of a second, just long enough to register the cruelty there, the hunger to see her flinch, then looked away as if he were already forgotten. Her walk to the scattered papers was even. Calm. Her scrubs didn't swish or hurry. She moved like someone who had time, which meant moving like someone who refused to give him the satisfaction of haste. The papers felt light in her hands as she gathered them, lab work showing Marcus Webb's electrolyte panels, his coagulation studies, the detailed medication schedule that proved she'd been right about the drug interaction he dismissed 2 days earlier in the cafeteria. The cafeteria incident had followed the usual pattern. Sarah carrying a tray, Salisbury steak that smelled like copper and salt, green beans soft from the steam line, water in a plastic cup, when Dr. Whitfield's elbow had caught the edge with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed the motion. The tray had gone vertical. Gravy had splattered in arterial patterns across the tile floor and up the front of her shoes, the leather darkening with grease. 50 people watching. Someone had gasped. Another nurse had reached to help, but Sarah was already kneeling, already collecting the pieces of shattered ceramic without trembling, without looking up, her hands moving with the muscle memory of someone accustomed to working under pressure. She'd cleaned it herself while Dr. Whitfield watched from the beverage station, his satisfaction palpable as humidity. That's when she'd realized the depth of his ignorance. He thought this was about breaking her. He thought humiliation was a tool that worked on everyone, that the weight of public mockery could make her crack like the cafeteria plate. He didn't understand that she'd spent 20 years building a wall so thick that his insults landed like rain on concrete, present, acknowledged, and entirely without impact. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling was restrained. Now, reassembling the chart files, she arranged them in reverse chronological order, exactly as hospital protocol demanded. Her fingers moved with precision, no hesitation, no anger, just the calm efficiency of someone who had performed delicate work under far worse conditions than a hallway floor. The medication schedule her eyes caught showed the flagged interaction still present. Whitfield had ordered a second antibiotic despite her documentation noting the contraindication. It was careless. Dangerous. And it was exactly the kind of detail that would matter later, when everything fell apart, if it ever did. She stood, the papers arranged in a neat stack, and extended the chart toward Dr. Whitfield. His hand reached out to take it, and that's when she spoke, her voice dropping to the register she kept locked away for moments like this, a voice that had commanded field triage teams in Tikrit, that had directed 10-person surgical rotations under mortar fire, that had earned her the rank of Master Chief Petty Officer in a Navy that didn't know her name. The timing you prescribed will interact with his current antibiotics, Doctor. Each word was distinct, separated by the careful silence of someone who never wasted breath. I flagged the contraindication in the electronic system per protocol. It's documented. Dr. Whitfield's face reddened, not the slow flush of embarrassment, but the sudden surge of someone realizing he'd been contradicted in front of an audience. His voice rose. Are you questioning my medical judgment, nurse? Sarah met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough to see the rage accumulating behind them. Long enough to let him understand that she wasn't backing down. I'm documenting the concern per protocol, Doctor. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds. 30 residents and nurses holding their breath. The heart monitor in the nearest room beeping its steady rhythm like a metronome measuring the moment. When Dr. Whitfield turned and walked away, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fists clenched at his sides. He wasn't done. Not even close. The question now was how much further he would push before something gave way. The rest of the shift moved through its motions, medication passes, vital sign checks, documentation that would stack up like evidence in a case she didn't know was being built against her. At 1900 hours, when the night crew arrived for their shift, Sarah completed her handoff reports and headed toward the staff lockers. The hallway corridors were emptying. The day was giving way to evening outside the windows, the sky over Houston shifting from blue to the particular shade of gray that precedes darkness. She'd been awake for 17 hours. Marcus Webb's vitals had remained stable throughout the day, though she'd noticed his blood pressure dropping in the afternoon, a slow decline, nothing dramatic, nothing that would trigger an alarm yet. But she knew the pattern. She'd seen it in field hospitals across 3 continents. That slow downward drift that meant something internal was bleeding. That meant time was running short. She found the supply closet on the 3rd floor, a room the size of a walk-in closet, lined with shelves holding fur tubing, bandage rolls, trauma shears, and the 1,000 small items that kept a hospital functioning. The fluorescent light flickered once when she pulled the door closed behind her, casting the space in that particular quality of institutional brightness that made everything look both sterile and exhausted. Sarah's hands found the edge of the metal shelf, her knuckles pressing against the cold steel until the metal bit into the skin. She allowed herself 3 deep breaths. Just 3. Nothing more. Pain is data. That's what her first commanding officer had told her in Tikrit, watching her work a 7-year-old's abdomen wound with hand steady as a surgical laser while rounds cracked overhead. Pain is information. Fear is information. The rage building in her chest right now, that was information too. It told her that Dr. Whitfield was feeling cornered, that her composure was beginning to frighten him in ways he didn't have language for. People like him, people accustomed to power, didn't understand quiet strength. They mistook silence for weakness. They mistook calm for acceptance. They didn't understand that the most dangerous people in any room were always the ones who'd already survived the worst and decided to survive more. She straightened, smoothed her scrubs, and stepped back into the hallway. The supply closet door swung shut with a whisper. Nobody had seen her enter. Nobody was watching when she left. By morning, Marcus Webb's condition would deteriorate enough that Dr. Whitfield would be forced to listen. By morning, Sarah would have her opening, a moment when the patient's needs superseded the doctor's ego. And then they would see who really understood the stakes. The worn combat boots remained in her locker where they'd been for 6 months, waiting. Tikrit leather, desert dust still visible in the seams, the laces tied in the particular knot she'd learned 20 years ago. Nobody at St. Michael's knew what they meant. Nobody understood that a Master Chief didn't take jobs. A Master Chief took missions. And missions didn't end until the objective was secured, or until someone pulled her out of the building by force. She'd been preparing for the second option since the moment she arrived. For in the morning, the fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song as Sarah moved through the ICU, her footsteps barely audible against the tile. Marcus Webb's vitals had been sliding for 6 hours, a slow, deliberate descent that every monitor in the room was documenting with clinical precision. Blood pressure 94/58 and falling. Heart rate erratic, jumping from 76 to 112 to 89, as if his chest couldn't decide whether to keep fighting. She'd seen this pattern before. Not in a hospital. In a field station in Tikrit, watching a 6-year-old's body reject the trauma of shrapnel and blood loss, watching his heart threaten to give up before his mind understood what was happening. Sarah pulled the chart from the foot of the bed and reviewed the notes. The surgical team's assessment was optimistic, too optimistic. They saw a routine training injury responding to conservative treatment. They didn't see the internal bleeding that was announcing itself in drops instead of torrents. They didn't see the cardiac strain from a body trying to compensate for blood loss it couldn't replace fast enough. Webb's eyes were closed, but his fingers twitched against the blanket, the unconscious language of a body in distress. She found Dr. Whitfield at the nurse's station, reviewing imaging on a monitor, his posture radiating the kind of casual certainty that came from never having to question his own assessments. Sarah approached with the chart held at waist level, her voice measured and even. Dr. Whitfield, Lieutenant Webb's pressure is declining. Heart rate is becoming increasingly unstable. I need you in Bay 3. No apology. No softening. Just fact, delivered like a report from someone who'd briefed commanders in situations where every second mattered. Whitfield glanced up, irritated at the interruption, his eyes sliding over her with the dismissive speed of a man who saw only the uniform, not the competence inside it. Pressure drops happen post-op, Nurse Chen. Fluids are running. He's fine. He turned back to the monitor, case closed in his mind. Sarah didn't move. His oxygen saturation is at 89%. The fluids aren't compensating. He needs a surgical evaluation. Now. Something in her voice, the absolute absence of doubt, the precision of the language, the refusal to be dismissed, made Whitfield stand. He grabbed his white coat, the gesture aggressive, as if moving quickly would prove he was still in control of the situation. Let's see this deterioration you're so concerned about, he said, his tone carrying the weight of a man about to prove someone wrong. They walked to Bay 3 in silence. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, steady and reliable, but the monitors told a different story. Whitfield's jaw tightened. He pulled up Webb's recent labs on the bedside computer, scrolling through numbers with increasing speed. The internal bleeding was worse than the notes suggested. The cardiac profile showed strain. His silence lasted 5 seconds, an eternity in hospital time. Call the OR, he said finally. We're going in. At 1,500 hours, the surgical theater was a controlled storm. The overhead lights blazed white, turning everything into sharp relief, every scar on the floor, every reflection in the polished steel equipment, every bead of sweat forming on foreheads. Sarah had requested assignment to this case, a simple clerical move that was approved without question because agency nurses never said no to overtime. She stood at the prep station, watching the surgical team assemble with practiced efficiency. The transfusion bag hung on the 4-pole, her blood type, O-negative with a rare subtype that matched Webb's perfectly. The unit coordinator had flagged it in the system, emergency donor on staff. Sarah had donated that morning at 0600 hours, filling the standard unit while the phlebotomist had made casual small talk about weekend plans. The blood was already typed, cross-matched, and ready. Like everything in her mission, it had all been prepared in advance. Dr. Whitfield made the first incision with a kind of tentative precision that suggested he was already questioning his decision to open. His hands moved through the initial layers, skin, fascia, muscle, with technical accuracy but no urgency. Sarah watched from her position at the instrument tray, reading the room like she'd read 100 combat zones. The surgical nurse across the table was tense. The anesthesiologist was watching the monitors with the intensity of someone who knew something wasn't right but couldn't articulate what. The resident assisting Whitfield was trying to anticipate the next move but clearly had no idea what they were walking into. Whitfield extended the incision deeper. That was when the monitors changed their song. The heart rate spiked to 146. The blood pressure flatlined. Not gradually. Not with warning. Complete cardiovascular collapse in the space of 3 seconds. Cardiac arrest, Sarah said, the words flat and informational. She was already moving, crossing the sterile field with the kind of fluid precision that came from having done this in a tent with mortar rounds walking across the roof. Whitfield stood frozen, his hand still extended into the surgical field, the scalpel trembling like he'd suddenly lost the ability to remember what it was for. The color drained from his face in a visible wave. Sarah didn't ask permission. There was no time for permission. She reached into the field, gripped the scalpel from Whitfield's grip, and extended the incision laterally across Webb's chest wall. The rib spreader was on the instrument tray, but it was too slow for this moment. She positioned her fingers beneath the xiphoid process and applied upward pressure, cracking the sternum with the kind of controlled force that came from understanding the geometry of human anatomy at a cellular level. The ribs separated, revealing the pericardial sac. She made one fluid cut through the membrane, and Webb's heart lay exposed in her palm, slippery, enormous, and completely still. Her fingers found the correct position, the left lateral wall of the left ventricle, fingers on either side of the apex. She began compressions with the rhythm she'd learned in a field hospital in Tikrit, working by candlelight and the sound of artillery, the rhythm that had saved a 6-year-old boy who was now 31 years old and bleeding out on her table. The muscle was firm against her fingertips, warm and wet. She compressed with the steady pressure of someone applying force to something that mattered, neither frantic nor hesitant, just perfect mechanical rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, the compressions matching the beat of her own heart, which was the only way to do this right. Epi, now, she said. The code nurse pushed 1 milligram epinephrine directly into the 4. Sarah didn't look up from the compressions. Whitfield, I need you to assist or step back. It wasn't a request. Her voice had dropped an octave. The timid night shift nurse had vanished completely, replaced by someone whose hands were literally holding a man's heart inside her chest. Whitfield stepped back. He moved toward the wall, his white coat suddenly too large for his frame, his hand shaking in a way that would be obvious to anyone who looked directly at him. The surgical nurse smoothly took his place at the opposite side of the table, understanding without words what needed to happen. Sarah's blood was flowing now, the unit on the 4-pole dripping into Webb's vein, her own plasma carrying oxygen molecules to tissue that was starving for it. The monitors showed nothing at first. 30 seconds of direct cardiac massage with no response, just the sound of her fingers working against ribs and muscle, the precise hydraulic rhythm of someone forcing a stopped heart to remember how to beat. 45 seconds. The monitor flickered. 1 QRS complex. Then another. Irregular at first, like an engine refusing to turn over. Then the rhythm stabilized, became predictable, became the kind of heartbeat that meant the body was choosing to survive. Sarah maintained the compressions for another 10 seconds, watching the rhythm stabilize on the monitor, sinus rhythm at 98 beats per minute, blood pressure climbing, 62/40, then 78/52, then 94/64. Oxygen saturation rising, 88, 92, 96, 98%. She released her hands from Webb's chest. The surgical team moved into the organized chaos of closing, sutures for the pericardium, sutures for the sternum, sutures for the skin. Sarah stepped back from the table, her scrub soaked with blood and saline and the exact visceral reality of what had just happened. She could feel her own heartbeat now, elevated but controlled. The surgical nurse caught her eye for exactly 1 second, a moment of connection that needed no words. The resident was pale. The anesthesiologist was making quiet notes about medications and timing. Dr. Whitfield stood against the wall, watching his patient be saved by someone he'd spent 3 weeks trying to break. The irony wasn't lost on him. His career had just been redefined in a single moment, from surgeon to observer, from the person in control to the person who'd frozen when the moment actually mattered. Within the hour, Sarah was back in her scrubs, having changed out of the blood-soaked surgical gown when the summons came. Administration. Secure floor. The security guard at the checkpoint looked uncomfortable, a veteran, she noted from the tattoo on his wrist, some kind of military insignia that suggested he understood the weight of moments like this. He scanned her badge. It worked. It always worked. For another 20 minutes. Dr. Whitfield had already made the calls. 3 of them, according to the paper trail that would surface later. To the hospital board chairman, a concerned physician reporting potentially fraudulent credentials. To the Texas Nursing Board, a complaint about unauthorized surgical procedures by someone without appropriate surgical training. To a private investigator in Austin, a request for background verification on an agency nurse whose credentials seemed somehow incomplete. The administrator, a woman named Diane Reeves who'd worked in hospital management for 17 years, looked genuinely uncomfortable as Sarah entered her office. Master Chief Chen, she began, then caught herself. Nurse Chen. We need to discuss the events in the surgical theater this afternoon. Specifically, your decision to intervene in a procedure that was being conducted by Dr. Whitfield. Sarah sat without being asked, her posture perfect, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't speak. Dr. Whitfield has filed a formal complaint regarding your actions. He's concerned about your training level, your credentials, and whether your nursing license covers emergency surgical procedures of that nature. Sarah still didn't speak. The silence in the office was like a held breath. An external investigator is going to be reviewing your file, Reeves continued. Your background, your certifications, your work history. It's procedure. Standard review. But until that's complete, we're going to need your badge back. Temporarily. It's just protocol when there's a formal complaint under investigation. She held out her hand. Sarah removed her badge from around her neck, the laminated ID card with her civilian name, her photograph from 6 months ago when she'd first arrived in Houston, her carefully constructed persona. She placed it in Diane's palm and watched something break in the administrator's expression. That badge had been her lifeline to the mission. Without it, she couldn't access the secure floors. She couldn't be in Webb's room. She couldn't protect him from whatever came next. The irony crashed over her. She'd spent 20 years protecting this man without him knowing she existed, and in the moment she'd had to choose between her cover and his life, she'd chosen his life, and now the cover was shattered. Webb's chest cavity opened under her scalpel with the precision of someone who'd done this before, in a field hospital in Tikrit with mortar rounds cracking overhead and a 6-year-old boy bleeding out on a stretcher. Muscle memory took over. Her hands moved on their own. The rib spreader went in. She could feel Whitfield's eyes on her, could feel the entire surgical team holding their breath, but her focus narrowed to the one thing that mattered, the heart. It wasn't beating. Pulseless electrical activity. She placed her hand directly on the ventricle, felt the stillness, and began. Compression. Release. Compression. Release. Her rhythm steady as a metronome, her pressure calculated to the millimeter, not too hard, not too soft. Just enough to push blood through a body that had stopped doing it on its own. Epi, 1 milligram for push, she said, her voice the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. A resident scrambled to comply. Nobody questioned her. In this moment, she wasn't the agency nurse Dr. Whitfield had been systematically humiliating for 3 weeks. She was the person keeping Marcus Webb alive, and her hands knew the language of survival better than anyone in this room. The monitor showed a faint blip. Then nothing. She kept compressions going, her shoulders moving with the rhythm, her breathing synchronized with the compressions, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way you were taught when you were trained to work in environments where you couldn't afford to panic. "Prepare the transfusion," Sarah said. "Oh, negative. The rare type. Blood that matched only 0.06% of the population. Blood that she'd already donated that morning, knowing it would be needed before anyone else knew it." The bag hung from the forestand, and the dark red liquid began its descent into Webb's arm, flowing into him like hope in a plastic tube, like the promise that some lives don't end in field hospitals. Like the promise that the 6-year-old boy she'd saved in Tikrit was going to survive this too. Another compression. Another heartbeat of her own body pushing into his. The monitor blipped. Once. Twice. Then a rhythm appeared, erratic at first, then stabilizing. 02 sat climbing. 65. 72. 80. Stable. "We have return of spontaneous circulation," she said, and somewhere in the surgical team, someone exhaled like they'd been holding their breath underwater. Whitfield's face was the color of old bone. He stood frozen by the instrument tray, his hands slack at his sides, watching Sarah Chen, just a night shift agency nurse, just someone he'd spent weeks trying to break, save the patient his negligence had nearly killed. She didn't look at him. She was already calling for post-resuscitation protocols, already managing Webb's airway, already moving on to the next thing that needed doing. That was discipline. That was the kind of calm that gets mistaken for coldness, but it's not coldness at all. It's the ability to compartmentalize horror and keep working because there's still a job to do. Webb stabilized. His vital signs held. The crisis passed in the way crises do, not with triumph, but with a slow return to normal, heart rate declining from the dangerous range, blood pressure lifting off the floor, the ventilator settling into its mechanical rhythm like a lullaby. Dr. Whitfield left the OR without a word. His mask was already coming off before he hit the doors. Within 60 minutes, Sarah learned what happened next. She was still in the scrub sink, washing blood from her forearms with the methodical care of someone removing evidence, when her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown hospital extension, "Report to administration immediately." She knew. The moment the words appeared on her screen, she knew what was coming. Whitfield hadn't frozen because of incompetence. He'd frozen because he understood, in that moment, what Sarah had just revealed. She knew things. She moved like someone with real training. She had access to rare blood that shouldn't have been available unless she'd planned ahead. She was dangerous in ways that didn't fit with the agency nursing profile. And he'd called in every favor he had. The administrator's office was on the 5th floor, north-facing windows overlooking the parking garage. The woman behind the desk, Margaret Chen, no relation, had the expression of someone who'd been told to conduct a termination but wasn't comfortable with the details. "We've received a formal complaint from Dr. Whitfield regarding an unauthorized medical procedure performed on a patient without proper supervision," Margaret began, reading from a memo that smelled new. "He's also raised concerns about your nursing credentials. We're initiating an external investigation with a third-party agency to verify your licensure status." Sarah sat in the chair across from the desk. Her hands were clean now. Her scrubs were already drying. She'd lived through worse conversations than this, in worse conditions, with worse stakes. All she did was nod. "Until that investigation clears you, you're suspended from duty, effective immediately. Your badge access will be revoked at end of shift." "Understood," Sarah said. She didn't ask what Whitfield had said. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain that her credentials were real, just enhanced, augmented, layered with classified documentation that would take weeks to unravel and would only raise more questions. The moment she started talking, the moment she started explaining anything at all, the lies would begin to multiply. Better to stay silent. Better to accept it. Better to look like someone who understood the gravity of the accusation rather than someone trying to run damage control. Margaret shifted uncomfortably. "For what it's worth, everyone on the floor says you're one of the best nurses they've ever worked with. What you did in that OR. Is what I was trained to do, Sarah finished, and her voice dropped half an octave, and something passed across her face, a flash of something that wasn't quite anger but wasn't quite resignation either. I'll return my badge. She left the office and went to the locker room. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with the sound of 1,000 small electrical deaths, one per second, the same sound that had driven her crazy on night shifts for 3 weeks but that now felt almost like a goodbye. She opened her locker. The combat boots were there on the bottom shelf, next to her personal items, the leather creased and weathered from a desert that didn't have rain, from mountains that didn't have names that Americans could pronounce. She picked them up. Held them. The boots were heavier than they should have been, weighted with every year since Tikrit, since the moment she'd placed her hands on a 6-year-old's chest and decided that his life mattered more than whatever mission had brought her to that place. The scrubs came off. Blue fabric, generic, stamped with the St. Michael's logo on the sleeve. She folded them with the precision of someone who'd been trained to fold things exactly, corners sharp, creases exact, every movement a small discipline. The stack went into the laundry bin, and for a moment she just looked at them there, at the stack of blue cotton settling on top of someone else's discarded uniform, blending in, becoming invisible, the same way she'd tried to become invisible for 3 weeks. The box she'd brought from home went into a plastic bag. Boots. Personal documents. The ID badge she'd used to open the hospital doors. Everything that connected her to St. Michael's was being packed away, sealed, removed. She sat in her car in the parking lot for exactly 5 minutes. The engine was running. The air conditioning was cooling the interior to a comfortable temperature. Radio static played from a station she didn't remember selecting. Through the windshield, she could see the loading dock where ambulances arrived at 2 in the morning with the kinds of emergencies that didn't wait for business hours. She could see the entrance where she'd walked in 3 weeks ago with a cover story and a mission and the weight of 20 years pressing down on her shoulders. The mission was over. Failed. The intelligence that Marcus Webb was supposed to deliver, the testimony about trafficking networks using military logistics, the names and dates and operational details, that would never reach the Pentagon now. Not through her. Not through St. Michael's. She'd compromised the entire operation by choosing to save a life instead of protect it. She drove out of the parking lot onto Richmond Avenue, and Houston spread out around her like a city that didn't know it had just lost a person it would never miss, because nobody had ever really known she was there to begin with. That evening, Dr. Whitfield sat at a table in an upscale restaurant downtown with 3 surgical residents who'd witnessed what happened in the OR. His third martini was sweating in its glass. His voice was loud enough that people at adjacent tables were beginning to notice, the kind of loud that comes from relief and vindication mixing together. You have to understand, sometimes protecting patients means making difficult decisions, he was saying, gesturing with his olive fork. Dangerous incompetence doesn't announce itself. It hides behind credentials and night shift work where nobody's watching. You spotted the weakness, and that's what separates real leadership from people who just show up. One of the residents, a woman named Dr. Patel, was nodding along, but her eyes had a distant quality, like she was watching him from very far away. None of them had actually believed the story about unauthorized procedures. They'd watched Sarah save a man's life with the kind of precision that only came from training. But this was Whitfield's hospital, and they were still residents, and there was a hierarchy, and you didn't challenge the hierarchy if you wanted a recommendation letter. But that wasn't the worst part. Not even close. She was loading her locker into a cardboard box when Derek pushed through the administrative office doors. Her 17-year-old son. Face flushed. Carrying something wrapped in dark velvet. The hallway conversations died. Every head in that corridor turned toward the sound of his voice, loud, defiant, a teenager who'd finally understood why his mother worked nights and kept old boots in a garage shelf. "Mom, they need to see these," Derek said, and he unwrapped the shadow box with the kind of reverence usually reserved for caskets. Navy Cross. First in the line of ribbons. Bronze Star with Combat V. 2 purple hearts arranged side by side like purple eyes watching the room. Surgical gloves snapped and fell silent. A nurse at the far end of the hall steadied herself against the wall. The Marine veteran working security, a man named Clayton, scarred across his left forearm like he'd drawn shrapnel from a mortar round, went rigid. His shoulders straightened. His hand came up in a salute that moved through the air like a blade finding its target. "Master Chief Petty Officer on deck," he called out, his voice cutting through the fluorescent hum with the weight of ceremony, and every military-trained person in that corridor responded instinctively. The resident stiffened. The nurses who'd served came to attention. The administrative staff had no idea what they were witnessing but understood that something sacred had just been announced. Sarah stood motionless beside her cardboard box. Hand steady. Eyes forward. The mask stayed in place even as the room restructured itself around her. Hierarchy collapsed. The night shift nurse they'd assumed was temporary, replaceable, desperate, transformed in a heartbeat into someone who'd commanded rooms like this in operating theaters where the only light came from headlamps and the only sound was arterial spray hitting surgical drapes. The administrative office doors opened again. A man in dress whites, pressed so sharply the creases looked like they could cut, walked through with the gait of someone accustomed to moving through spaces where lesser people automatically stepped aside. Rear Admiral James Webb, commander of Carrier Strike Group 7. The insignia on his uniform caught the overhead lights like a promise of consequence. He'd flown 2,400 miles from San Diego the moment his brother Marcus told him the truth. That it hadn't been the incompetent freezing Whitfield who saved his life. That it had been the woman in the corner, the one standing so still she barely registered as human. Master Chief Chen. The Admiral's voice moved like oil, smooth, inexorable, transforming everything it touched. "I've reviewed your service record. Declassified portions, anyway. 22 years. 83 combat deployments. 47 lives saved in field conditions." He pulled a folder from under his arm. The kind of folder that had been handled by people in windowless buildings, stamped with classifications that made everyone in this hospital suddenly understand they were standing in the presence of something they had no clearance for. "Your record indicates that you performed emergency triage on a 6-year-old Iraqi civilian in Tikrit on March 14, 2004. You donated bone marrow to that child in a field hospital. You tracked his recovery for 2 decades while conducting intelligence operations across 3 continents." The administrator's face had gone the color of old hospital sheets. "That child," the Admiral continued, opening the folder, "is now Lieutenant Marcus Webb, Navy SEAL, stationed with SEAL Team 3. He provided a sworn testimony this morning to Naval Criminal Investigative Service." The Admiral's eyes met Sarah's for exactly 1 second, not long enough to be disrespectful, long enough to communicate that his entire career had been built on honoring people like her. He stated that Master Chief Chen maintained her cover operation yesterday when he delivered critical intelligence regarding unauthorized weapons trafficking networks in the Arabian Peninsula. His testimony has been filed. The operation is complete. The Admiral turned to Dr. Whitfield. The movement was slow, deliberate, the kind of directional shift that made apex predators move their heads to track prey. Whitfield was pressed against the far wall, sweat darkening the collar of his white coat. He'd seen the medals. He'd heard the rank. Understanding was spreading across his face like a stain, the realization that he'd been publicly humiliating someone whose single day of training would have qualified her to run his entire surgical department. "Doctor," the Admiral said, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "I'm informed that your investigation into Master Chief Chen's credentials triggered an automatic audit of your own surgical department." The administrator stepped forward, a folder shaking in her hands. She opened it with the precision of someone executing orders, though no one had given her any. "Dr. Whitfield, the audit uncovered a pattern of falsified patient records dating back for years. Post-surgical complication rates were systematically underreported. 73 cases. All modified to maintain your department's quality metrics." Her voice cracked. She swallowed and continued. "Additionally, there are documented payments from 3 pharmaceutical representatives. Wire transfers. Cash deposits. In exchange for prescription protocol preferences that benefited those companies over patient care outcomes." Whitfield's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again like a fish suffocating in air. Your medical license is suspended effective immediately, the administrator continued, and the words fell like stones into a well. Pending criminal investigation by the Texas Medical Board and the Harris County District Attorney's Office. Hospital legal counsel is filing a report within the hour. The room held its breath. Someone's badge clattered against the tile floor. No one moved to pick it up. Security will escort you from the building, the administrator said. You have 15 minutes to collect personal items. Clayton stepped forward, his movements economical, professional. Not rough. Just inevitable. Like gravity. Your hospital credentials, doctor. Now. Whitfield fumbled with his ID badge. His hand shook so badly he dropped it twice. The second time it hit the floor, the plastic shattered. No one helped him retrieve it. He left it there, broken beside a smear of what looked like old coffee stain, and shuffled toward the exit with Clayton moving behind him like a shadow with rank insignia. As they passed Sarah, Whitfield slowed. His eyes searched her face as if the answer to his destruction might be written in her expression. Sarah met that gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Her face was composed as a stone temple. Then she looked away first. That's what broke him. Not the medals. Not the admiral. Not the suspended license or the pending charges. It was the moment a woman he'd spent 6 months humiliating, mocking, attempting to destroy, looked at him with such utter absence of emotion that he understood he'd never registered as a threat. Never been consequential enough to earn even her anger. The elevator doors closed behind them. The sound of them sliding shut echoed through the corridor like a final punctuation mark. The Admiral turned back to the hospital administrator. Master Chief Chen's cover operation concluded successfully 24 hours ago when Lieutenant Webb provided his testimony to the appropriate authorities. Her actual nursing credentials are classified at the highest levels, but her surgical competence is documented across 5 continents and 38 peer-reviewed military medical journals. I trust there will be no further questions regarding her qualifications. The administrator shook her head so hard her glasses nearly fell off. Her medical license should be expedited for full reinstatement, the Admiral continued. And I would recommend reviewing her employment status. Master Chief Chen deserves more than a night shift. He turned to Sarah. Extended his hand. The gesture carried weight, not just respect from one rank to another, but acknowledgement of sacrifice that most people would never understand. Sarah's hand met his in a grip that lasted 3 seconds. In that contact was 20 years of silence. 2 decades of watching a child grow into a warrior while the world believed she was just a nurse. 12,000 nights on the night shift while classified operations unfolded invisible to everyone around her. Thank you for bringing my brother home, Master Chief, the Admiral said quietly. It was my honor, sir, Sarah replied. The first time anyone in that hospital had heard her speak with the authority of her actual rank. The words landed with weight. Derek still held the shadow box. He was crying silently, tears running down his face as he finally understood why his mother had been absent for so many of his childhood moments, why she'd flinched at unexpected sounds, why she kept those old Ticrat boots like some people kept wedding rings. 6 months later, Sarah walked past a strip mall in suburban Houston. Derek beside her, carrying college textbooks from his campus visit. The afternoon sun had turned the storefronts golden. Through the window of a vacant space, there was a folding table. A hand-printed sign, supplemental insurance, free quotes. Dr. Whitfield sat behind it alone, his suit rumpled, his face aged by 6 months of unemployment and criminal proceedings. His medical license gone. His colleagues' calls unreturned. His network, once so carefully cultivated, evaporated the moment his utility ended. When he looked up and saw Sarah, his eyes dropped immediately to his shoes. His shoulders curved inward like a plant withdrawing from light. Sarah didn't slow her pace. On her hip, in the leather messenger bag she carried, rested the same worn combat boots from Ticrat. The ones with Ticrat sand still in the creases, the leather still cracked from desert sun and carried weight. Next to them, a framed photograph. Lieutenant Marcus Webb in full SEAL dress uniform, saluting the camera. His chest bearing the ribbons he'd earned across 6 deployments. A man who should have died at age 6 in a field hospital but instead became the man who testified that his childhood savior was a legend. "You ever going to tell me the full story?" Derek asked. Sarah considered the question. The city moved around them. Traffic. Conversations. The ordinary rhythm of a world that had no idea what invisible wars had been fought in its hospitals and deserts. "Some stories take 20 years to finish," she said. "And some people mistake silence for weakness until it's too late." They continued walking. Behind them, Dr. Whitfield turned off his laptop. Another day ending without a single customer. Another evening staring at a phone that no longer rang. Inside St. Michael's, on the main corridor of the surgical wing, a bronze plaque had been mounted, Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, USN, in recognition of distinguished service to our nation and extraordinary care to our patients. The night shift nurses passed it every evening. Some saluted. The new residents learned quickly that competence doesn't announce itself, that hierarchy isn't the same as capability, and that the quietest person in the room might be the one holding it all together. If you loved this story of hidden strength finally recognized, please subscribe to see what happens when a quieter hero walks through your hospital doors. Like this video if you believe some people deserve to have their sacrifices seen. And in the comments, tell us, what would you have done if you'd realized you'd been humiliating a decorated officer?